welcome to those who are joining us here and to those many who are joining us from around the world for this event on sustainability, equality, and peace, integrating the climate change and women, peace, and security agendas. We are coming to you from the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland, where we and so many others are working to advance gender-responsive actions to more effectively address the climate crisis. I'm Melanne Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. One of the values of the COP conference is the ability to come together with like-minded leaders and allies from around the globe to address the climate change challenge and to chart the way forward for more effective solutions. And those solutions come both from the global level and certainly from the local level. Those are critical perspectives. We are so pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the United Arab Emirates, Mission to the United Nations, with the Support for Women in Agriculture and the Environment, SWAGEN, in Uganda, and with Rural Women Energy Security, RUWES, in Nigeria, and you will hear from them as well. We will also hear from leaders in the governments of Finland and the United States, from the Asia Development Bank, and from the private sector, in this case today, MasterCard. And we're pleased to have all of them joining us for this important discussion. 3 years ago, our institute, in concert with Mary Robinson, hosted a global convening of leaders from across the climate change, gender, and security communities to work to bridge the silos between us and between those silos that each was working in. Because understanding the gender, climate, and conflict nexus is essential to better climate change solutions. By virtue of their social and economic status, women are disproportionately affected by climate change. The droughts and flooding, the agricultural losses and natural disasters are also forcing women and their families to leave their homes and migrate. The destruction of livelihoods and the growing displacement are also sparking conflict over dwindling resources and competition for those resources. And it is leading to climate change as a growing security issue, indeed a threat multiplier. At the same time, women are leading climate solutions. They are on the front lines, and you will hear from two of the women on the front lines today, the front lines of adaptation and mitigation. But women are still too often marginalized from the planning, the decisions, the investments that are being made in this space. And yet their leadership and their participation is absolutely essential. Many have been working tirelessly to highlight and act on the gender dimensions of climate change. And we at the Institute at Georgetown have also been working to fill the research gaps, including our latest report on the gender-climate conflict nexus, amplifying women's contributions to advancing solutions at the grassroots level. The scale of concrete actions remains insufficient, and we know that urgency of this moment will only accelerate. And so to help us grapple with these questions today, we have an extraordinary array of leaders. And I will go first to Ambassador Lana Nusebe, who is the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations. She is a longtime champion for women and girls, and she is focusing very strategically on the link between women, peace, and security and climate change. And we at the Institute are very proud of our partnership with the United Arab Emirates on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Ambassador Lana Nsebe, we are eager to hear from you.
Milan, greetings from New York, and thank you so much to you, to Georgetown, and to our co-hosts and speakers today. I'm honored to join such a distinguished lineup. I remember, Milan, the first WPS panel series we did back in 2015, when we decided to focus a session on climate's impacts on women in conflict and fragile settings. There was skepticism about the urgency of the link between gender, climate, and security, as though coordinated action was an interesting idea, but not a must-have. And where there wasn't doubt, there was uncertainty about how one actually acts, beyond recognizing that there is in fact a link. I'm so relieved that today, skepticism is on the wane, and that is because of the activism and haunting testimonials of so many women from the front line of climate change in fragile communities. The nexus is no longer a stretch of the imagination when you hear hundreds of women from the Lake Chad Basin describe how crop failures led to poverty and migration in their community, to their becoming the head of their household, to their coping with armed gangs entering their space, or even to their teenagers becoming open to the ideas of extremism. And it's even harder to deny when you then hear alarmingly similar stories from low-lying islands in the Indian Ocean or hurricane-devastated Haiti. The pace of climate change is terrifying, and given the last few years alone, almost all of us can understand, if not firsthand, then secondhand, how a drought or a devastating flood or saltwater contamination can be the straw or boulder that breaks the camel's back. At the same time, there are mountains of evidence piling up from the 20-plus years of the WPS agenda that confirm that women are essential for recovery from these shocks and these tragedies. Who is most likely to manage their children's nutrition and education? Whose second or primary income is going to get the family back on track? Women's centrality to stability is no different in a climate context. The UAE accordingly puts gender-sensitive climate security at the heart of our foreign policy. As you may have heard earlier this week, the UAE has been endorsed to host COP28 in 2023, which is both a thrilling and humbling responsibility. What makes it an unusual opportunity is that it coincides by design with our 2 years on the UN Security Council, which starts in January. Climate security and the Women, Peace and Security agenda are all-encompassing, cross-cutting topics, and they require activation of the whole UN and international system. This nexus is not going to be solved by the Security Council or the UNFCCC alone, so our goal as the UAE is to consult widely and work in multiple venues on practical steps that use women's empowerment to reduce climate impacts on stability and inequality. Today, I wanted to propose 3, but by no means exhaustive, potential focus areas for our discussion and consideration. First, an area of great concern to the UAE is that of food security. Agriculture and fishing are so vulnerable to climate change, and there is ample documentation of what happens from a security perspective when food-producing communities in conflict-affected regions begin to lose their livelihoods. One of our main focuses over the next 2 years will be trying to institutionalize adaptation support to food producers as a form of security investment. What we need to do as part of that package is ensure that women are part of the decision-making and that they receive an equitable level of support. Establishing reporting minimum metrics for multilateral partners is a good starting point. Second, climate change only increases the importance of women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in peace and recovery processes, so that the ways they experience climate impacts are reflected, and so that they are guiding resource allocation. We should be open to quotas. They do work. That said, certain peace processes are undeniably harder for women's participation, but that's not an insurmountable hurdle. We have compelling examples from the UN where peace envoys and senior officials have set up women's advisory bodies or held mass consultations, including online, that are more gender balanced. These are concrete ways to raise women's voices, and as member states, we need to ensure that every peace and recovery process has a clear-cut gender inclusion mechanism. Third, we need to accelerate the drumbeat of women's testimonials and guidance on climate security at the Security Council and across the UN system. The UAE will work with partners to increase the number of women from climate-affected communities who brief the Council, as well as to ensuring that the UN Secretariat, in its reports to the Council, systematically considers how climate affects women and how women can be part of the solution. Climate is not always going to be the defining factor for a security situation, but gender is undoubtedly going to be a key factor for climate security. Let's assess and report consistently. Climate impacts are a threat to security and women suffer disproportionately, but women, as ever, offer the solutions for stability and recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nusebe. Thank you for those concrete recommendations, but most importantly, for your leadership. And we all look forward to the time when the UAE in 2023 will be hosting COP conference then, and also working hard in this leadership position in the Security Council, because we're confident these issues will play a central role in your leadership. We turn now to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, Pekka Haavisto. The minister has led Finland's efforts to advance international peace and security, gender equality, and action on climate change. From his extensive experience in crisis management, political negotiations, and mediation, he has worked firsthand on the climate crisis gender nexus, including his work as Special Representative to Sudan and Darfur, and as chairman of the UN Environment Program. Minister Haavisto, we are so happy to have you back with us, and I know that we're looking forward, all of us, to your remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good to see you, and best greetings from Helsinki. Many thanks for the invitation to this important discussion, and I want to thank all the organizers, including the United Arab Emirates and Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security, for focusing on the urgent need to better integrate the climate change and women, peace and security agenda. For my government, Finland, implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a priority. Women must be seen, first and foremost, as agents of change and not merely as victims of conflicts. The key is to ensure women's full, equal and meaningful participation and mainstreaming gender perspective in all sectors, be it peace processes, crisis management, the security sector or migration. Women's participation is a necessity for sustainable peace. When women are included in peace processes, peace agreements are more likely to be reached and more likely to last. I have seen this firsthand in the processes I have been part of. With the COP26 now in process, I want to turn my attention now to climate. Climate action is at the very center of all our government's guiding policies, be it foreign, security, trade or development policy. Finland aims to be climate neutral by 2035 and the first fossil-free advanced economy. Climate change is an existential crisis for the humankind that threatens global peace and security, while disproportionately impacting already fragile or conflict-affected countries. The adverse impacts of climate change also continue to overly burden the poorest and the most vulnerable, especially women and girls. UN has estimated that 70% of people living in global poverty and most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are women. To address the existing inequalities, the gender perspective must be taken into account in all climate action. As UN Secretary General Guterres has stated, we need continued intensified efforts to address the linkages between gender, climate and security. Here Finland wants to be at the forefront. Further, it's also important to recognize the critical role that the girls and women play as powerful agents of change to address climate crisis. Women have valuable expertise in, for example, management of natural resources and resiliency strategies. Acknowledging this, we need to ensure the meaningful participation of women and marginalized groups in national policymaking and planning and legal reforms. This applies both to home and elsewhere. In its National Action Plan for 2025, Finland recognizes the link between gender, climate change, natural resources and peace building, noting the challenges and opportunities to women by climate change. I'm proud to also say that with the help of Finland's advocacy work and funding, gender considerations were incorporated into the Paris Agreement in 2015. The collaboration between Finland and the Global Gender and Climate Alliance enabled the participation of 60 women delegates from 44 developing countries in the climate negotiations and the formulation of 21 national climate and gender equality plans. As the Security Council has the main responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, I would like to stress the importance of including the issue of climate security on its agenda. Finland hopes that the Women, Peace and Security and Climate Change nexus will receive more attention in the continued discussions in the Security Council. The impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on conflict are highly contextual. Whether we are engaging in prevention, mediation or peace building, we need to invest more in conflict analysis that takes into account and assesses the climate and environmental aspects of the specific conflict and its gender sensitive. I have personally been involved in this work previously with the UNEP, for example, in Afghanistan. In his recent report on women, peace and security, the Secretary General notes positive developments in the UN system to address climate adaptation, peace building and gender equality, such as the Climate Security Mechanism Initiative, which helps the United Nations system address climate-related security risks more systematically. Ladies and gentlemen, to achieve sustainable peace and development, women's participation is a necessity. Finland and Spain, in partnership with the UN and the Georgetown Institute, have initiated the initiative Commitment 2025 on women's inclusion in peace processes. It includes 10 concrete commitments to the UN and member states to promote women's participation in peace processes. The Women, Peace and Security and Climate Change nexus would be promoted and observed also in this work. It's essential that the gender perspective is taken into account also when making financing decisions, applying climate finance instruments, and ensuring women's participation in the allocation of financial resources, especially in crisis and conflict settings. The Gender, Climate and Security Nexus offers a unique opportunity for funds dedicated to climate change mitigation and adaptation to address the root causes of conflict and to reach greater transformative results. Finland is the founder and co-chair currently with Indonesia of the Coalition of the Finance Ministers for Climate Action. The key objective of the coalition is to work on how to best integrate climate aspects as an integral part of economic and finance policy. The coalition can help by bringing finance ministers together to share experiences and design economic policies. The gender dimension could also be taken into account in this work. Ladies and gentlemen, these are some ideas on advancing the important gender, peace and security and climate change agendas in our continued common efforts. Thank you for your attention and have a good conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Haavisto, and thank you for your leadership, your personal leadership, and your government's leadership in this space. You're mentioning at the end the whole issue of finance and the ministers coming together with the Finnish minister is certainly very encouraging because that's such an important area. We're pleased to be working with you and your government and other governments on Commitment 2025. And I remember from years ago how Finland was in the lead of really working to bring women to the table on climate. So thank you for all you're doing and all that you continue to do. We turn now to Assistant Secretary Monica Medina from the United States. She is the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment, and Science. She was previously the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmospheric Issues, and the Special Assistant prior to that to the Secretary of Defense, working on issues focused on women and the military. And I must say, as a matter of personal preference, to also say that she has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University focusing on these issues. So welcome so much, Assistant Secretary, and perhaps you can give us a sense of how the United States is thinking about the issues of gender and climate security.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. I want to commend you for your groundbreaking leadership on these issues for so many decades. As a Georgetown professor and alum, I'm particularly proud of the Institute's work. This is a topic of critical importance to discuss here at COP26, but one that has too often been sidelined in the discussions in these halls. The disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and children can no longer be ignored. It could not be more clear to us that the climate crisis and gender inequality are inextricably linked. All around the world, women are so often the ones bearing the brunt of this crisis, losing their traditional livelihoods, struggling to provide food for themselves and their families, and facing increasing risks of violence and conflict. Women are too often the ones responsible for gathering the very natural resources that climate change makes more scarce. There is also increasing research that even in the difficult case of climate migration, it's too often men who are moving to urban areas in search of jobs, while women are increasingly left behind to care for their families in this increasingly extreme environment caused by climate change. That is where cycles of violence, insecurity, and conflict can all too often come in. Climate disasters themselves can cause domino effects, uprooting the natural and social world around them. Disasters like drought or extreme storms can displace people from their homes, take out economic opportunities from an area, and have devastating impacts on the health and well-being of communities. Women, girls, and the gender diverse, because of their pre-existing marginalization, can too often feel the brunt of this, with their safety, education, health, and livelihoods first affected. But the response to climate-related disasters and emergencies can be gender-biased too, can reflect this deep gender bias in certain societies. Too often, our responses do not reflect the specific needs and perspectives of women and girls. Following a historic flood or typhoon, do women and girls have the sanitation access they need for health care? In the midst of an enduring drought, do new mothers have access to adequate nutrition to feed their infants? Are any women at the table to make these unique needs known and plan adequately around them? And if they are, do they face the threat of retaliation and violence from their attempts to hold governments accountable? Women and girls, in all their diversity, must be included from the very beginning in writing climate policies and plans at all levels. If they are not, that's only going to increase the insecurity and magnify disaster when it strikes. As my colleague, USAID Administrator Samantha Power said the other day in a panel on gender that we spoke on, climate change is sexist, but our responses do not have to be. I'm proud to say that the U.S. Department of State remains committed to advancing the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security. This is a crucial component of our foreign policy, and we need specific emphasis on addressing the gender-climate conflict nexus. And the good news is the Biden administration is hard at work putting this commitment into practice. This spring, President Biden passed a bold new executive order establishing the White House Gender Policy Council. This council sees advancing gender equity as a matter of human rights and a critical national security imperative. And just a few weeks ago, the council released a comprehensive new gender policy and strategy that has a specific pillar dedicated to addressing the nexus of gender issues with climate change. We'll also be making sure these unique challenges are present in all our top strategy documents, from the U.S. National Security Strategy to our top foreign policy planning documents at the Department of State. Before we conclude, I want to turn briefly to the topic of gender and climate here at COP26. We're taking action on the ground and translating that into new commitments in our work together these 2 weeks. And as I've said over and over again in all the events, the U.S. is back. For too long in the past, women have had to fight to be on their country's delegations to important meetings like this and have representations in these halls. Now I look around me and I see women leading everywhere, on this stage, sitting across from me in bilateral meeting after bilateral meeting, and leading their delegations at the ministerial level. And it's making a difference in the agreements we create. I'm pleased that the negotiators from my bureau, Olivia Urbanski and Rachel Katzenberg, at the State Department are advancing gender and climate issues in the decision text itself, including through the 5-year enhanced Lima work program on gender and the Gender Action Plan agreed to at COP25. Just like we see here in Glasgow, we see women around the world leading solutions to these interlinked crises. The relationship between women, girls, the environment, and the communities that makes them particularly poised, uniquely poised to develop local and on the ground, thus much more effective climate interventions. Women and girls may be uniquely and disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, but this does not make them victims. Instead, they are leading their communities in developing the next generation of solutions that we need desperately to mitigate and build resilience against these challenges. So thank you very much, Milan, for the chance to discuss the U.S.'s contribution this week, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Medina, and I very much appreciated your telling us how the inclusion of women leads to climate security, whereas their exclusion leads to greater climate change insecurity. And it's something I think that's paramount in this discussion today. We all welcome the United States' leadership on climate, and I think it's worth pointing out that the United States now has a law on women, peace, and security, and is playing a major role in integrating gender into climate policies, as you so eloquently pointed out. So thank you for being here with us. We're now going to turn to our panel, and we're going to begin with 2 local activists. And I think we all understand, as Ambassador Nasebe said, we need to bring the local advocates to the Security Council to explain why their participation and their knowledge and their understanding of what has to happen at the local level, both for adaptation and mitigation, is so critical. So we're going to begin with Gertrude Kenyangi, who is the Executive Director of Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment in Uganda. She leads efforts at the grassroots level to advance climate change adaptation and community resilience, 2 very, very important activities. She brings a gender lens to conservation and resource management, critical areas in addressing climate change. And at Swagan, she focuses on women's empowerment and sustainable environmental development, working to make sure that women have decision-making power and access to resources. 2 things we must keep talking about, having that decision-making power and access to resources for climate change solutions. So Gertrude, we're very happy to have you with us here for this discussion today. In Uganda, you have been supporting the critical role of women in environmental sustainability before it got on the international agenda. You have been at this a long time, particularly in the agriculture sector, which we know a great majority of women in a number of countries are the majority of the workers in agriculture. They are hit the hardest, perhaps, by many of the climate impacts, whether droughts or flooding, and they are particularly critical to adaptation. So perhaps we could begin, Gertrude, by your telling us how you see the connection between gender equality, climate change, and security in your work, how you sustain and work with and support women in agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and probably give us some examples so we can understand how this works in the efforts that you are making in Uganda.
Thank you very much for this opportunity that you've given me on this world stage. My name is Gertrude Kenyangi. They've already introduced me. and I'm here to speak about the connection between gender equality, climate change, and security. The two have very strong backward and forward linkages. Gender equality is to do with the needs, the constraints, the preferences that men and women have. It has its root in those differentiated needs of men and women. It so happens that the community from which I come, especially, in fact, majority of sub-Saharan Africa, the system of governance that we espouse is patriarchal. And patriarchy has handed power to men and denied power women. Women have been excluded from having power. And the person who has power allocates resources, assigns responsibilities. As such, women have been marginalized from having endowments through cleverly crafted norms, values, beliefs. For instance, women do not inherit from their fathers. And land is acquired through inheritance or through purchase. As such, majority of women, in fact, only 7% research has shown of women in sub-Saharan Africa own land that is titled. So that has denied them complete access to land. It has only given them controlled access, regulated access. It has denied them control of this land, and it has denied them decision-making powers regarding utilization of the most important resource, which is land. And I'm talking about land alone, but there are other resources, productive resources, that women do not have access to. As such, women do not have anything to use in a climate disaster. They cannot absorb the shock, they cannot adapt to the change, and they cannot recover from that change. And the neoliberal economic system, the neoliberal economic system has so dictated that men move away from home and go work in towns, while women have been socially constructed to remain in the private sphere. Men have been allowed to go out and work in the public sphere to earn wages. As such, they are not at the scene of the disaster when it happens. And it's women who have to deal with the disaster without the prerequisite resources to fall back on, without the bargaining power to invoke, without the authority to apply, So you find that women are having a lot of problems in that regard. So when it comes to, when women are suffering in that way, majority of women, by the way, are suffering in that way, you find that when the men come back, they've been socially constructed to be heads of families. All the good, when a family is doing very well, it's attributed to the man. And when it's attributed to the man, if it's doing poorly, the man suffers what we call collapsed masculinity. And it turns it into violence. He turns his shame of not being able to take care of the family into violence, which he metes on his wife and the women folk in his family. And this domestic violence is known to spill over to other areas, spill over into the community, spill over into the nation, spill over into the region. Because the conflicts in our region all stem from limited access to resources, conflict over resources, inadequacy of resources. So climate change has been known to cause conflict, but also to be a problem to the women, to the women who are responsible for looking after their families without the prerequisite resources. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gertrude, and also for noting how those impacts not only contribute to the conflict that we all see as infringements on security, but also conflict within families and the acceleration of violence. And I hope that you can tell us a little bit too about agriculture and ways in which you might be moving agriculture adaptation farther. Do you have the resources and the know-how that you need to deal? You mentioned the consequences, but how can those consequences be averted?
Okay, agriculture, women in my country, for instance, in my community, provide 80% of the agricultural labor force. And we are practicing traditional African agriculture, which is organic by default. It's not sustainable because traditional African agriculture does not recycle on-farm nutrients deliberately. We knew that all along we had fertile soils and we could shift from one part of the land to the other. But right now, with the increase in population and effects of climate change, and we can no longer afford to do that. Now we need to recycle the nutrients on the farm. We need to practice ecological agriculture. We need to practice that, and that is deliberate. So we need to train, we need capacity building, and that's what we've been doing as an organization. We've been building the capacity of communities to respond to climate change, adaptation, not only in agriculture, but also in energy, in lots of other things, because adaptation covers a whole range of responses. So agriculture, since I'm talking about agriculture, we've been trying to integrate livestock farming with crop farming. We've been trying to recycle nutrients on the farm and make sure that a small plot of land will be able to support a large family. We can no longer afford to open up new ground, because this too has an effect. When we have to open up new ground, we cut down forests. You find that it's all a cycle of devastation. So that's what we've been doing.
That's really helpful to understand all of that and how it all fits together. So thanks so much, Gertrude, and we'll come back with additional questions. We're going to turn now to Nafisah Abubakar, who is head of the Secretariat for Rural Women Energy Security, RUWES, in Nigeria. It's a project that aims to provide access to clean energy technologies and market skills to women. She's long been dedicated to safeguarding the health and welfare of rural women against the effects of climate change, environmental pollutants, and especially in addressing energy poverty through safe, affordable, and sustainable clean energy access for all. So we know, again, Nafisah, how important this area is as well in terms of access to clean energy, to renewable energy. So tell us a little bit about your work in Nigeria with rural women to promote access to clean energy. What are some of the activities in which you and RUWES engage? Have partnerships been helpful to you? And what more has to happen? Because obviously, we were talking earlier, and there is so much more need than has been addressed to date. But if you could give us a picture of what it's like.
Very true. And I would like to say I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be here today, to be able to just state what these issues are. Now, what we are, Rural Women Energy Security, is that we try to be the in-between between the rural woman and her access to clean energy. We support them. We know that energy is very important to them in terms of cooking, in terms of heating, in terms of lighting. And they do not have the clean ones. What they use are the fossil fuels. Now, as I mentioned, it's this vicious circle where the women are not aware that their practices is what is causing the issues for them. So they're going around, they're felling the trees to gain access to firewood to use, and then they're dealing with the effects, but they have no idea. So this came about as a need to let's give them access to this clean energy. Let's educate them on what they're doing wrong and what they need to do right. So that's where RUWES came in. So what we do is that we work with manufacturers. We partner with manufacturers, with private sector, with the government to get access to this renewable energy products. And then we leverage on our network of women. The way we are structured in RUWES is that we have a network of women. We have what we call coordinators in every state in Nigeria. That's 36 states. And then each of these coordinators are supposed to register a collective of women under them. So association of women, faith-based organizations, market-based organizations, NGOs that deal with people in the rural areas. So that when we get access to these clean energy products, we give them to these organizations who then go down into the rural areas to give it to the women in the rural areas and also to educate them on the need for this. Now, we've done a number of this intervention projects, as I mentioned, some sponsored by private sector, some sponsored by manufacturers, because we have a lot of partnerships with manufacturers that want to have their products out there in the market. Some sponsored by the government in terms of wanting to make a difference to the lives of their communities. So we have been able to get have them gain access to these technologies. Now, what we've seen to be important is not just to take the technology to them and just drop it, but to also explain why it's important that they use it. Because most times you go and you give them the technology and it's free, and they would collect it's free. Everyone loves free, and they take it. But when you go back to monitor, you see that they're not using it. And we begin to ask questions, and they tell you they don't understand the importance. It's not suitable for their needs. It's not convenient, so they just go back to their old practices. So we had to go back to the drawing board to say we need to educate these people. We need to educate these women, especially the women, because it's just been said here, they are the drivers. They are the drivers. The woman, most times, because of the conflicts all around, the woman is left to fend for her community, to fend for her family. We've seen a situation where, let me give an example, northern Nigeria. Northern Nigeria, especially the northeastern part and parts of the northwest that borders around the Lake Chad. Now, we all know what's happening with the Lake Chad. It has depleted significantly, and a number of people earn their livelihood around the Lake Chad. We have farmers, we have fishermen, we have herders, a lot of them. Now, because of it's depleted, there's a lot of conflict over this dwindling resource. A lot of conflicts between the farmers, the herders, and everything. And this is now a breeding ground for other terrorists. We have Boko Haram, we have ISWAP. They just take advantage of it, and they penetrate the area, and they begin to spread, especially in the northern parts of Nigeria. Now, once again, because of this dwindling resources, the men now have to migrate to urban areas to fend for their families, and the women are left alone. These women are now need to provide for their needs, especially energy, are foraging deep into the deserts to get firewood, where they now become susceptible to attacks. We hear situations where women are raped, women are kidnapped. In 2014, I'm sure the entire world heard what happened to the 276 girls in their schools. They were taken. Now, it was shocking, but that's not the first time. That happens every day. Till date, it still happens. And it happens to these women, and they have no choice. They need to go out there and they get the wood. And they do not understand the desert is encroaching. They don't understand why it's encroaching. But it's also part of their practices, felling the trees that would stem this rapid advancement of the desert. They don't understand it. So we have seen the need to educate them, and educate them in their own language. So what we do is that we go into the community, we select women that already are a bit empowered, women that are like the women leaders, women that are strong in what they do, and we educate them. We tell them, these are the things that you're doing wrong. These are the things you need to do right. This is why you need to use these energy products. And we make them we call them energy entrepreneurs in this community. And we tell them, go forth and spread this information. And we have seen that that works a lot, because they are more willing to listen to their own people who understand their struggles and their sufferings than you that just come in with your products that they feel, what are you trying to give us? So that has really helped us a lot to educate the people in this. And what we also try to do is to give back to this community, not just come and try to, because in a way, using firewood is cultural for them. They tell you, we grew up to our grandmothers and great-grandmothers doing this. The men tell you, oh, they prefer food cooked on firewood. It has a different taste. It's also like, especially at night, the children and the women gather around the fire, and because they have no electricity. So you take this away from them, you take this bonding experience from them, and you replace it with a stove that is not really convenient for their need. They're not going to adhere to it. So you need to give back to this community. You need to give them something that they can hold on to. So what we have done is also try to build up on their skills to make them to support these products. Because we've given them the products, we know these products might have issues, so we train them on assembling these products, first level support for these products, and we empower them. And we feel that even with that knowledge, you see a difference in this woman. You see a willingness to embrace this technology. So that has really helped us a lot. Now, in terms of partnerships that we're looking for, I've said it one. The most important partnership we're looking for here is one, more donor coordination in terms of gaining access to this renewable energy products. We've done quite a bit, but we've not really made that much of an impact because of funds. The funds, we need to have this fund so people, we can get more access to it and spread it down into the community. So that's one. We also need to have partnerships with the manufacturers. I just said it. Most of these renewable energy products being sent to the rural areas are not suitable or convenient for their needs. You have large families that cook with large cast iron pots, and they have this little camping stove, for lack of better, to use. It's not suitable. And if you know the cooking style of African women, you're cooking gruel, you're cooking paste meals that are very labor intensive, and you need to go in there and mix. And you have this stove. So they just set it aside. And we've had discussions with manufacturers of stoves, tell them, this is not suitable. You need to make it bigger. You need to make it more durable. You need to also involve these women in what this is the end user, yet she has no voice in what you're sending to her. So we would like to see those kind of partnerships. Partnerships also in terms of knowledge transfer for, as Gertrude mentioned, climate smart agriculture, skills acquisition for them to support these stoves. You're sending a product to them. What happens when something goes wrong? You're all the way in Europe or America. How do you provide support? Obviously, they're going to set it aside. But if you make them, and we know they can, these women they might not be lettered, but they're extremely intelligent and smart. Just with a little training, they do so much. So we would like to see that. Most importantly, we would like to see manufacturers set up assembly plants in Africa. If you're going to give us this dose, you need to transfer this knowledge to us. You need to empower the people with them. And I believe it will be a key to adoption. When these communities feel that they are part of these stoves coming to life, they will, it's like their baby. We've trained women to assemble Save 80 stoves, to assemble EnviroFit stoves and Bond stoves. We've trained them to assemble solar lights, and we see how passionate they are about it. They treat it like their babies. So these are the partnerships we would like to see. We also would like to see sensitization. It's very, very key. We are all here talking about climate change, and we're talking about how it affects the rural woman. She has no idea what we're talking about. She does not know what this climate change is. Yes, she knows a woman in Borno in Nigeria or Yobe knows that the desert is rapidly encroaching. She has had to migrate, she has had to move, she has lost her husband and children to all of the insurgents. She has no idea what's causing it. She just knows something is wrong. So you go and you're speaking this language and they don't know what you're talking about. So there needs to be concerted and constant efforts at sensitizing them about climate change and also letting them know that your practices also are affecting this. Your practices are putting you in this situation, and these are the things that you can do to manage the situation. So just to me, funding, sensitization, stove design, setting up assembly plants in Africa, those are the key things that we would like.
Well, Nafisah, you really took each aspect of the nexus and really expanded on how they fit together and how the one impacts the other. And I think what you said about renewable energy being culturally adapted to where it's utilized or intended to be utilized, how important it is to bring that local knowledge into those decisions that are made, and then to give women the skill set to maintain those new tools, so to speak, but also to create businesses out of them, which would make all of this sustainable. So thank you for that, and we'll be back to get some more of your recommendations. But first, we want to turn to Zanabel Woods, who's the Senior Social Development Specialist and a former Gender and Social Development Specialist at the Asia Development Bank. ADB plays a critical role in financing and implementing inclusive climate action in the vulnerable Asia-Pacific region. Zanabel is representing ADB virtually here at COP, and she brings over 30 years' experience in addressing barriers to gender equality and inclusion in order to respond to climate challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. So, Zanabel, it's so good to have you with us and to bring this whole financing issue into play, because we know that is critical. You've heard it from so many of the speakers today, and particularly from our women who are with us from Africa today. So in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly the Pacific Islands, which we know are catastrophically impacted by what's happening thanks to climate change and the submersion they're increasingly seeing of their islands from the water. What, from your work at ADB, can we understand about this nexus with climate, gender, and security? Why does it matter? And how is ADB working to integrate gender in climate finance and resilience work, which is, again, so critical to keep the impacts from being even worse than they are? So welcome, Zanabel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can hear you terrifically. Thank you.
Okay. And I'm not sure. I hope my camera is on as well.
Everything is working well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. I mean, the first question, why does addressing the gender nexus matter for ADB? As your other speakers have said, you know, we see that existing gender norms are contributing to increased climate and disaster risks that women are facing in the region. As others have discussed, women may have limited access to factors that are key to cope with climate change, such as access to resources, technology, education, and information. We also have seen, both through COVID, but also in times of disaster, that gender-based violence has increased in post-disaster settings. And we understand that women's social role provides them with a deeper understanding of vulnerabilities, which can be critical to strengthening resilience. So, and then on the other hand, we know that there is also an important nexus between gender, biodiversity, and management of natural resources. So women in the region, particularly in agricultural settings in the Pacific Islands, act as primary caretakers and natural resource managers. They typically take a leading role in collection of water, firewood, and fuel for cooking, and also provide healthcare through traditional medicine. So, and we know that women control a large part of the food production in the region. And on the other hand, there still remain few legal rights to land, where globally, you know, or in the region, a very small percentage of women actually have title to land. So just to answer your question, so we work on both climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So in terms of adaptation, we look at how we can build the capacity to adapt, for women to adapt production and growing practices through improved skills and access to climate information and resources. That usually happens through projects that involve working on issues related to agriculture, natural resource management, and working with agricultural value chains. We also have been doing a lot of work on strengthening resilience of women-led enterprises through increased access to climate information, knowledge on resilient product development, and resilience in supply chain. And then finally, we work to include women in resilience-related decision-making processes, including allocation of resources, which the other speakers have also mentioned. We also have are working on strengthening women's disaster risk management, so strengthening their access to participation in early warning systems, women's access to disaster microfinance products, and engagement and participation in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. So just very quickly, because I know we have limited amount of time, but the other aspect around mitigation, which is really important, and the previous speaker spoke about, which is access to energy. So ADB has recently adopted a new energy policy, which actually includes quite a strong focus on ensuring that women have access to renewable energy, for women to use renewable energy in the productive use of energy, investing in women to lead small-scale renewable energy enterprises. And we really, the new energy policy really puts a focus on women in a just transition to support moving away from fossil fuels. And then, so finally, I want to just very quickly address the issue of climate financing. So ADB has twin targets, one on climate and one on gender equality. So for all of our projects, we have a target of 75% for them to be climate mainstreamed and 75% to be gender mainstream. So in a way, this makes us both a climate bank for the region and a gender equality bank, because we obviously will have a large amount of our projects that will have will overlap in terms of these 75% of projects that are both gender mainstream and climate mainstreamed. And so we see, for example, climate investments projects that include targets and designs to address gender issues and promote gender equality, for example, that are gender transformative. So where women, we look at how to increase women's voice and agency. Others have talked about looking at women as agents of change in sort of the climate crisis, and in terms of supporting women as agents of change. So our projects try to address that. In terms of infrastructure and services, we look at those that are not only climate resilient, but that substantially improve the lives of women and girls. In terms of women's entrepreneurship, we're looking at how to support women-owned and women-led enterprises, particularly in the green sectors and the green economy. And then we're looking also at how we can enable for an environment for women's labor force participation, including workplace equity. So looking at staffing management, boardroom representation along supply chains, but we're also looking at where there are opportunities for women to be employed in the green economy as well as the blue economy. So I think those are some of the ways where we're integrating sort of gender into our climate finance. And finally, if I can just briefly speak about an initiative that was just recently launched, and is the Community Resilience Partnership Program, where we have, with the support of the Nordic Development Fund, the UK government, and the French Agency for Development, where we will be supporting community-led adaptation efforts in our projects, and all of those the projects that we support will have to have our second highest gender mainstream. We have 4 categories at ADB of gender mainstreaming. It will have to have the second highest gender mainstreaming category, and it will also have a dedicated window to support women-focused investments. We know that we have to be intentional about ensuring that women have access to climate finance. And we cannot just only look at climate finance in sort of the co-benefits that I may deliver for gender equality, but we actually really do need dedicated resources to ensure that women have the resources necessary to lead on climate adaptation and mitigation. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Sanibel, and thank you for that explanation of how all of this fits together. I love when you said that ADB is both a climate bank in a way and a gender bank, and how considerations of gender for climate change impacts for the better in adaptation and mitigation are possible through this kind of financial arrangements that the bank represents. So thank you so much for that. We're going to turn now to the private sector, because it too is an important element in all of this. And we're thrilled to have with us Ann Cairns, who's the Executive Vice Chairman of MasterCard, representing the company around the world. She focuses on inclusion, diversity, and innovation. This includes leading the transformative work on access to finance, especially for women, globally, and she's also the chair of the 30% Club, which is a global campaign to increase gender diversity at the corporate board and senior management level, and is bringing this topic to COP as well. The private sector needs to be playing a growing role in all of this. It is a critical partner, and so we're pleased to have the perspective that Ann can bring to this discussion. Ann, welcome. It's great to have you here. And I wonder, in terms of how you see access to finance, I know as key for women to engage in addressing climate change. We have been talking about access to renewable energy sources that become sustainable through women's enterprise development, the green economy, and the role that women can play in the green economy. But they can't play that role without the access to the financial arrangements that they need to be able to do that. So how in all of this do you see the role of the private sector, particularly a company like MasterCard that has been so critical to growing small and medium-sized businesses that women are helming around the world? And how do partnerships with the private sector work in this space to catalyze the kind of good that you've been hearing us talk about over the last hour or so?
Well, good afternoon, Milan, and it's wonderful. I'm actually here with you in Glasgow, but I couldn't get from my last meeting to the conference centre fast enough, so I'm just joining you from elsewhere. First of all, I found it an absolutely fascinating discussion. Absolutely, the private sector has a part to play, but it needs to play that part, as you pointed out, in partnership with government and with society. We need to mobilize the 3 legs of the stool to really make things happen. If I think about my own industry, I'm in one of the world's biggest financial technology companies. What role can we play? Well, we actually reach something like 3 billion people on the planet with our products and services. Overlay on that the fact that 85% of the world's day-to-day buying decisions are made by women. And you see that actually the people who are using our products and services are largely women. on a day-to-day basis. And why is that important? It's important because I think collectively as consumers, women have enormous power to influence climate change. And women care about the future. They care about the communities they live in. We've heard that from the other speakers. They care about their families and investments in the future. And they care about things such as where goods and products are sourced, whether they're sourced sustainably. They're starting to ask those questions. So if we can actually mobilize the collective buying power of women around the world to actually be making the right choices for the future, by giving them, educating them with the right data they need to make those choices, and making the choices inexpensive enough for them to opt for them, then I think that we can have a good impact on climate change. Here at MasterCard, we've opened sustainability labs up in the Nordic region, and we're working with a company called Economy, which can actually calculate what your carbon footprint is according to what you buy. So if I buy a piece of clothing, if I eat a certain thing like a beef burger, for example, that affects my carbon footprint. And we can give that information to consumers through things like mobile phones and so on, so they can see what their choices are doing to climate change. And on top of that, we can overlay things such as, for example, consumers collect points about, as they're buying things. And in the past, certainly pre-COVID, much of those points went to buying things like air miles. Now you can use those points to actually plant trees. So not are you not just buying air miles, but you're actually doing something that, can have a positive impact on the carbon on the planet. And so you can offset at a consumer level your own carbon footprint. So this is the power that technology brings, and the power to reach many people on the planet. If I think about it from a different angle, women in finance, about 40% of the world's wealth is now moving into the hands of women. This is a great thing. We heard from our colleague from Africa on the panel how few women in Africa still own land and can't really get the influence over that asset that they actually need, while 80% of them are actually farming. I mean, that's something that's really sad. But the good news is, because of the change of laws around the world, women are inheriting more money. And as women inherit money, there is research showing that they are much more interested in what their money is doing in terms of things like sustainable investment, impact investment. They ask the questions about the companies they're investing in. And the more money that goes into the hands of women, the more questions like this are going to be asked, and the more the money is going to be mobilized to solve some of the world's problems that we need to have solved. Well, where does government come into this? I mean, I was intrigued by the cooking pot example in Africa, by the way, as well. And although I actually think cooking in Africa is probably not using huge amounts of resources of the planet, if we think about, the fuel burning in some of the developed economies. But if we think about, how do governments address things, then I do think that the governments have a massive role to play on setting their net zero agendas and actually moving their whole economies into the right direction to try and avoid climate change. And they need to be putting the right level of education, resources, and money into making that happen. And we need some of the big governments in the world to step up to do that. How does it relate to what the private sector is doing? Well, I know my own government in Britain is looking at things like insulation, heat pump replacement, solar panels, and mobilizing the private sector to be able to deliver all of these things to consumers, and the consumers to be educated about what they need to be doing in their individual homes at the same time as making all of those things available. It requires a lot of coordination between society, the private sector, and the public sector. And many of these decisions actually around the home, once again, are made by women. Women as well as men, but women make a lot of the household decisions. So I think that you see women playing a part both in the infrastructure, increasingly in the finance, certainly in the consumer buying behavior of the planet. And, you know, even if you look at things such as electric cars, the car industry is saying that while it was considered sort of, you know, in the minds of car manufacturers that they were appealing to men, women are actually pretty influential in deciding which family vehicle is used, and thinking about the dynamics and the cost of running vehicles and so on. So I could go on ad infinitum about this, but I think it's an incredibly interesting area. Women are not just victims of climate change. Women are able to actually combat climate change when properly thought about, mobilized, designed for, and included. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you for bringing that dimension to this discussion and the power of women's purchasing abilities today and what that can do to create change in the myriad ways that you just described for us. We had wanted to go on with more questions to our panelists, but alas, we have come to the end of our discussion with you today. But before we take our leave, because time is up, I want to thank Ambassador Nusebe, I want to thank Minister Havisto and Assistant Secretary Medina for their remarks and their perspectives. I want to thank in a very special way Gertrude and Nafisah for coming here to COP and from Africa and being with us from Uganda, Nigeria, respectively, and for the hard work you do and the change you're trying to make happen, and hopefully to influence decision makers on why we've got to pay greater attention to the role of women at the local level. And I want to thank Zanabel, of course, and Ann Cairns for the perspectives that they brought from finance and the private sector. I think you'll all agree this has been a rich discussion, but we have to go from discussion to action, to concrete actions, and that requires each and every one of us, no matter what we do, we can work to diminish our carbon footprint and do so much more in the process as well. So thank you for joining us, whether here in Scotland or whether someplace around the world. Thank you all.